Welcome to our Sunday School Bible study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, September the 29th. It's our final lesson in our 5-unit study theme of foundations as we look at the first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis. This week our lesson is entitled Humanity Rebels, and we're going to focus in on chapters 10 and 11. And again, we're going to see humanity, humans, rebel against God's commands and the result of that. There are 4 great events recorded in these first 11 chapters in Genesis. The creation of the universe, and that was our first lesson. The fall of man, we spent 2 lessons studying about Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel. And then the flood, and that was last week's lesson. And this week is the construction of what we call the Tower of Babel. And all of these events reveal that where mankind disobeys God, the Lord judges sin, and then in His grace, He makes it possible for a new beginning. Adam and Eve sinned, but God clothed them and promised to send the world a Redeemer. Cain killed Abel, but God sent Seth to carry on the godly line. In Warren Wiersbe's commentary, he suggests the Sethites intermarried with the Cainites, and God had to wipe the earth clean with a flood. That's what we studied last week. But Noah and his family believed God, and they were spared. After the flood, the descendants of Noah's 3 sons repopulated the earth. And that's what we'll study about tonight. But the new beginning with Noah eventually led to one of the most arrogant revolts against God recorded anywhere in Scripture. After living in the ark for just over a year, Noah and his family stepped out on dry ground, and God made a covenant with Noah that He would never again flood the whole earth to destroy sin. And after that flood, God commanded Noah's sons to spread out over the earth and multiply. That was in Genesis chapter 9. Genesis 10 has the record of that, of them fulfilling that command, partly in their descendants there, being the forerunners of the nations. But just like we see Genesis 2 kind of drill down on a more general part in chapter 1, in chapter 11, we're going to see how that growing of the population was dispersed and scattered into all the world. Creation had a fresh start, so you would think that obedience and a desire to walk with God would be foremost in the minds of all of these people. But as we'll see, sin still corrupted the hearts and minds of each new generation. And once again, God would not tolerate their rebellion. In chapter 10, our focal passage is the first 9 verses in chapter 11. But in chapter 10, we're told these are the records of the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And sons were born to them after the flood. And then in the rest of chapter 10, we have the breakdown of those, of at least some of those descendants of Noah. The first record in verses 2 through 6 are the sons of Japheth. And it lists 7 sons and 7 grandsons. But interestingly enough, there are only grandsons of 2 of the 7 sons listed. So we're left kind of to speculate whether those other 5 didn't have sons or whether they're just not listed. But there's a total of 14 descendants listed there of Japheth. And then picking up in verse 6, the sons of Ham, and there are 4 listed, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And those are relatively familiar names to us. Cush, the Cushites are ancient Ethiopia. That's not the same as present-day Ethiopia. Mizraim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. Put equates with Libya in most people's mind. And then we're familiar with the Canaanites, who were in the land where the children of Israel went in to possess the land. There are 30 descendants of Ham named. And in these verses that detail the descendants of Ham, there's a kind of a parenthesis to discuss Nimrod. Nimrod, the famous hunter here. And he's important to our study because we'll see that he's the builder of the city of Babylon and 3 other cities in that region. He's also the builder of the city of Nineveh and 3 other cities in Assyria. And of course, the Babylonians and the Assyrians will play a huge part in the children of Israel's life. Verses 21 through 31 detail the descendants of Shem. And it focuses on Eber, from which the term Hebrew comes. There are 26 descendants named of Shem. And of course, Eber is the father of the Israelites, the Hebrew nation. And we'll see more about that in chapter 11 there. Verse 32, the final verse in chapter 10 says, "These are the families of the sons of Noah according to their descendants, by their nations, and out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood." So that kind of defines the author's purpose in giving these lists of names. These names give a kind of a panoramic view of the nations as a backdrop for the rest of the Old Testament. There are exactly 70 nations represented in the list. And that number 70 often symbolizes the totality. And so it represents the totality of the nations. All nations find their ultimate origins in these 3 sons of Noah. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary, says the list of names and places carries with it some important theological truths, not the least of which is that God's the Lord of the nations. God gave the nations their inheritance and determined the times appointed and the bounds of their habitations, as Luke tells us in the book of Acts. Second, in spite of external differences, all nations belong to the same human family. God made us all of one blood. Again, Acts 17. No race of people can claim to be superior to any other race or people. Third, God has a purpose for the nations to fulfill. The account in Genesis 9 through 11 make it clear that God's chosen nation was Israel. From chapter 12 on, Israel will be center stage in the narrative. But God also used Egypt and Babylon, Assyria, Media Persia, Rome to accomplish his purposes with reference to the Jewish people. And fourth, God is concerned for all the nations. Frequently in the book of Psalms, you find the phrase, all ye lands, or all nations. And so it expresses this universal vision that all the nations of the earth will come to know God and serve Him. The church's commission to go into all the world isn't a New Testament overthought. It's written into the warp and woof of the Old Testament story. Warren Wiersbe uses that interesting. I'm not familiar with that term, warp and woof. It's a sewing term, actually. Warp represents the horizontal threads in a piece of cloth, and the woof is the vertical, the ones that run crossways there. It's actually in the Old Testament, those terms, warp and woof. So I learned something. It's a good deal. That's chapter 10. As we move into chapter 11, we take what's happened in chapter 10 and we see how the command to the sons of Noah to spread out on the earth and populate the earth was corrupted, and how it came about that command ultimately was fulfilled. First point in verses 1 through 4. The whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. As people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let's make oven-fired bricks." They used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered throughout the earth." So, chapter 11 picks up in a time frame here when the whole earth had the same language. All the people spoke the same language and vocabulary. So it would appear to be a time soon after the flood. And we're not told what the language that they spoke was. No one knows for sure. But it seems there was a common language that was understood by all the people living at that time. And verse 2 then tells us that people migrated from the east and found a valley in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. The land of Shinar is the region of ancient Babylon in Mesopotamia. It's part of modern Iraq, and this is a place that God's people revisited again and again. God would call Abram to leave that land, to go to a land that God would give him and his descendants. The people of Judah would spend 70 years in exile there. Throughout Scripture, Babylon became a representative of the human pride and godlessness that attracts the judgment of God. When the Lord returns at the end of the age, all of heaven will rejoice when rebellious Babylon and her children are finally destroyed. We had studied a little about this in Revelation not very long ago. And you remember in chapter 9, verse 7, God had commanded the people to be fruitful and multiply and to scatter across the earth. Genesis 9:7 says, "As for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly." Literally that says swarm in the earth and multiply in it. Our lesson writer points out that many commentators believe that the architect of Babylon was Ham's grandson, Nimrod. Chapter 10, verses 8 through 12 record how he built that city and 3 other cities in that area. His name means rebel, so he represents kind of the rebellious nature of people to resist what God has commanded. Perhaps the people feared that spreading out would make them vulnerable or cause them to lose their sense of unity. So instead of trusting God's provision and protection, again, we see that they thought they knew better than God. And so they were content to settle in one place, to stay where they were comfortable. And in that vein, they set out to make a monument to their greatness. And so they said to each other, come, let's make oven-fired bricks. And then there's a parenthetical expression there in verse 3 that they used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. The use of bricks for building large structures was common in the early period. And the use of the huge quarried stones that we're familiar with, weighing many tons, came along later. These mud bricks can simply be dried in the heat of the sun, but the strongest ones were fired in kilns. And oven-fired bricks were more expensive, and they were used for special buildings. And so that's what they used. Come, let's make oven-fired bricks here. And verse 4 gives us a glimpse into their thought process, into their motivation. They said, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. So motivated by pride and arrogance, they wanted to make a name for themselves. And they feared that they might be scattered or dispersed and not achieve the greatness that they sought. The term Tower of Babel is not found in the Bible, but we use that term for the structure built there on the plain of Shinar that's referred to here. Most believe that the tower that they built at Babel was what's known as a ziggurat. Archaeologists have excavated several of these large structures, they were built mostly for religious purposes. And the ziggurat was like a pyramid, except that each successive level was recessed so that you could just walk to the top, kind of like steps there. At the top was a special shrine dedicated to a god or goddess. Archaeologists have found a number of these, and one of the best preserved is that in Ur. It has a base 200 feet by 141 feet, so you can picture that's a huge structure. The bottom terrace is 50 foot high. So you can kind of get a picture there of this kind of structure. Jewish and Arab tradition actually identifies the Tower of Babel with the Temple of Nebo in the city of Borsippa, now called Beers Nimrod. So whether that's the actual Tower of Babel, I don't know. But that's the Jewish and Arab tradition. In building that structure, the people weren't trying to climb up to heaven to dethrone God. They hoped that the god or goddess they worshiped would come down from heaven to meet them. The structure and the city were called Babel. Elsewhere in the scripture it's Babylon, so it's the same place. And the name literally means the gate of the gods. This project was kind of an arrogant declaration of war against the Lord. And it's kind of like the revolt described in the second Psalm, first 3 verses. Why are the nations restless and the people plotting in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let's tear their shackles apart and throw their ropes away from us. So, to begin with here, the people were resisting God's edict to scatter and repopulate the earth. So they decided to build this city and stay together. But even more than that, they wanted to make a name for themselves so that others would admire them, perhaps come and join them. So their purpose statement here is much like the devil's lie to Eden, in Eden to Adam and Eve. You will be like God, as we saw him say in Genesis 3:5. The people had several things in their favor. They were a united nation, one people, speaking one language, using one vocabulary. They were motivated by one spirit of pride and a compelling desire to make a name for themselves. But the thing that was missing from all that they had in their favor was the approval of God. So, the Believer's Bible Commentary calls it a policy of pride to make a name for themselves and defiance to avoid being scattered. To us, the tower may also picture fallen man's ceaseless effort to reach heaven by his own works instead of receiving salvation as the gift of grace that God intends. Because the people feared being scattered, they planned to unite and build this powerful fortress that would allow them to call down their God to protect them and their descendants. So, as we move into point 2, let's look at verses 5 through 9. Verse 5, the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the humans were building. And the Lord said, if they've begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So from there, the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it's called Babylon, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth. When Moses records for us, then the Lord came down to look over the city, that's a figurative way of speaking that indicates the omniscience, the all-knowing Lord. And God has demonstrated repeatedly that it doesn't pay to rebel against his will. Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Jesus warned that those who exalt themselves will be abased in Matthew 23:12. So God in heaven is never perplexed. He's never paralyzed by what people do on earth. Babel's conceded, let's go up, by heaven's calm, let's go down. Again, continuing on in that picture in Psalm 2, verse 2, verse 4 says, he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. So, God figuratively came down to look and see what's going on. And the Lord said, if they've begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Now, how could this project make nothing impossible for humankind? The Quest Study Bible says that phrase, nothing will be impossible, refers to their potential for doing evil. It's similar to our figure of speech saying anything can happen or the sky's the limit. When people unite around selfish interests, the power that results can be extraordinarily dangerous. History demonstrates the tragic results of people using power in the wrong way. So that's what God's talking about here. If this goes on unchecked, there's not much limit to what trouble they can get into. So his solution in verse 7, come, let's go down there and confuse their language so they will not understand one another's speech. The us in that passage is similar to the language we saw back in chapter 1 in the creation account when in verse 26 when God said, let us make mankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth. So the plural pronoun there emphasizes the majesty of the speaker. Kings refer to themselves in that way. The Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is plural, perhaps indicating God's taking counsel with himself or describing a discourse with the heavenly court of angels, but it also may be a hint at the Trinity. In the unity of God, there is that plurality of the Trinity. So let's go down, he says, and confuse their language so that they won't be able to understand one another's speech. Variation in language, culture, values, and clans started at this point. And if it hadn't been for that human arrogance, that division wouldn't have been necessary. And as we've recently studied in Revelation, one day peoples of all languages and cultures will unite to celebrate the grace of God's risen Son, lifting their voices together in praise of the Lamb. So what was then will be restored in that time, that unity. Revelation 5, starting in verse 8, says, when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each one holding a harp and the golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to break its seals, for you were slaughtered and you purchased people for God with your blood from every tribe, language, people, and nations. You have made them into a kingdom and a priest to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. So, from there, the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. There are 3 great judgments on sinful humanity in this first section of Genesis. The first is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden in chapter 3. The second is the flood that we studied last week in chapters 6 through 9. And the third here is the scattering of the people from Babel. And that scattering, if we go back and look at chapter 10, there's enough familiarity with the names of those descendants of Japheth and Ham and Shem that we can kind of get an idea of where they went. Those descendants of Japheth, in them you see the Greeks Spain. Tarshish is one of the names in that lineage. And so it seems that the descendants of Japheth went west and north there into the islands of the Mediterranean and up in the Black Sea area. The sons of Ham, it seems, went mostly south. You've got Egypt and Ethiopia and Libya, and then the Canaanites who were in the Palestine area. And then the sons of Shem, the Shemites, the Jews and Arabs are the descendants there of Shem. The word Shem means name in Hebrew, and Abraham was promised that God would make his name great. He's a descendant of Shem, as we'll see in just a minute. The people of the world depend on their own wisdom and efforts, and yet they fail to achieve lasting fame. Who knows the name of anybody that worked on the Tower of Babel? And yet the name of Abraham is known around the world and revered by Jews, by Muslims, by Christians. So there's a vast difference between mankind's "we will make our name great" and God's "I will make your name great." Earlier I mentioned that there were 3 great judgments on sinful humanity in the first section of Genesis. The expulsion from Eden, the flood, and the scattering of people from Babel. With each of those judgments, there's a corresponding provision of grace. And so it is here. And beginning at the end of chapter 11, beginning in verse 10, we see the beginnings, the genesis of God's provision for the redemption of mankind after he scattered them over the earth. So let's take a quick look at the rest of chapter 11, and it'll be a good lead-in to our next unit of study as we focus on Abraham and Isaac in the next 4 weeks. Starting in verse 10, we get another genealogy, and this focuses on the generations of Shem and one of his sons particularly. These are the records of the generation of Shem. Shem was 100 years old when he fathered Arphaxad, 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived 500 years, and he fathered other sons and daughters. But then as we follow this, Arphaxad fathered Shelah. Shelah fathered Eber. Eber fathered Peleg. And Peleg lived 30 years and fathered Rau. And Rau fathered Serug. And Serug fathered Nahor. And Nahor fathered Terah. And Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So now we get to people that we're familiar with. Terah, the father of Abraham, as well as Nahor and Haran. So this genealogy forms the most direct line in Genesis. It's regular and formaic, and it suggests an interest only in recording the line that shows the connection between Shem and Abram here. Picking up in verse 27, we have the record of the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died during the lifetime of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was unable to conceive. She did not have a child. All of that information will be important as we study through the life of Abraham. Now Terah took his son Abram and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they departed from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they went as far as Haran and settled there. And that's where Terah died there. Abram was a mighty man of faith and one of the most important men in history. 3 world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, venerate him. He's mentioned in 16 books of the Old Testament, 11 books of the New Testament. His name means exalted father, or as changed to Abraham, father of a multitude. Next week, we'll turn our focus to God's relationship with Abram. And it's not just that Abram was the ancestor of the Jews, but it's the fact that he was the man through whom God's purposes of salvation started to be achieved. Adam's disobedience precipitated a deluge of sinful acts that ended in a flood. Noah, the new father of the human race, was blameless, but he also fell, and that culminated in the pride of Babel. This in turn was punished with a judgment that affected all of mankind. Now, with Abraham, God starts again, this time promising that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We'll pick up with that next week. What do we need to learn from our lesson this week? Warren Wiersbe says, man proposes, but God disposes. That familiar statement's almost a religious cliche. Many people who use it don't even know what it means. It was written by the Augustinian monk Thomas à Kempis in the late 1300s or early 1400s in his classic book on the imitation of Christ. An expanded version is the proverb, man does what he can, God does what he will. Solomon used more words, but he said it best in Proverbs 19:21. There are many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel, that will stand. Few chapters in the Bible illustrate this truth better than the 11th chapter of Genesis. When you read the narrative about Babel and then read the genealogies that follow, you understand that God's at work in this world and is accomplishing his purposes in spite of the plans and projects of sinful people. People built a tower and a city called Babel as a monument to their own greatness. God thwarted their arrogant behavior by causing all the people to speak in a different language. This caused the people to scatter over all the earth. God will not permit us to replace him as supreme in the universe. We belong to him and we're responsible for our actions. Come back next week and we'll pick up in Genesis chapter 12 there as we study the promises of God in the next 4 weeks.